Is ABA, Applied Behavioral Analysis, really the gold standard for our autistic children and our PDA children? So today, I'm going to be talking about the research on applied behavioral analysis, which underpins not just clinical settings, but also most of special education and early intervention programs here in the United States. So applied behavioral therapy, applied behavioral analysis is increasingly controversial in the neurodiversity space. And there's a lot of testimonies from adult autistic advocates who went through applied behavioral analysis-based therapies as children who have PTSD, have experienced trauma and or experienced ABA as abusive. So their voices are incredibly important, and as a researcher, I look at those as valid data points for primary resources on the impact, right? But my role in the PDA space and the neurodiversity space is really not as an advocate or someone who identifies as autistic, but rather someone who will take an objective and neutral approach to every question and draw on my academic professional training in order to take an objective stance, right? Also, my goal is not to persuade you one way or the other, but rather to inform you as a parent about how you can make decisions with accurate information and without judgment of yourself, and I'm not going to judge you either. So that is what I hope to do today with you to give you more clarity on applied behavioral analysis, what it is, what it underpins, what the research actually says in the peer-reviewed journal articles. And my goal for you is, at the very least, to feel more confident making decisions that might not include behavioral modification techniques, and to not feel the shame and condescension that many of us have felt when our PDA children received an autism diagnosis and we were provided ABA as the only viable option, as the only thing covered by insurance, and it being the gold standard. And for many of you who are listening to this as a podcast or watching this now, you may have experienced that as well, where your child got an autism diagnosis and you were only presented with ABA as the gold standard and the only thing that could help your child. And if you didn't follow that recommendation by the pediatrician, then you were looked at as not caring for your child or not doing the right thing. Okay, so feel free to reflect on that if you're listening, and or if you're here with me live, to drop a heart if that was your experience. Okay, so what we're going to do today, we're going to talk about what is ABA, Applied Behavioral Analysis, as defined by the research. We're going to talk about the logic of why for many, not all, PDA children, ABA can be traumatic and lead to burnout. We're just going to talk about the logic of why that is, with the acknowledgement that I have worked with parents for whom modified ABA for their PDA was actually nourishing because it provided a safe nervous system and novelty and dopamine and a chance for social engagement. Okay, so that is the footnote in what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about why this topic matters to parents like us. And then we're going to dive into the logic and the research about what is actually said in terms of the effectiveness and impact of ABA on a collective scale, right? So when we're talking about the research, we're talking about average findings, we're talking about large N samples, meaning not one single child. So there is no judgment if your individual child is thriving in ABA, okay? My goal is just to ask the question with all of you, all of you, why is this the only option? And why are we being shamed if it's not what we choose? And this underpins not just therapy, but also the approaches that are taken with our children in the public schools and special education, early intervention, and public education in general. Okay, so let's start with how ABA is defined in the research study that I'm going to dive into. Okay, so it is, for the purpose of our current review, ABA will be defined as an intervention informed and developed from behavioral analytic approaches for the treatment of children and youth with autism spectrum disorder, page 527. So I am going to, after this, put the citation so that you can look at the primary research yourself. Okay, so what does this mean? This means that we're not just looking at an intensive 40 hours a week in a clinical setting. We're looking at all types of therapy and educational practices that are informed by any type of behavioral modification in terms of operant conditioning. Okay, trying to change the behavior and teach the child through this method. So this will apply in clinical spaces, therapeutic spaces, early intervention spaces, special education spaces in school. The only exclusion of a setting for this study, it's a meta-analysis, was they're not including studies on hospital inpatient settings, okay? So that is the definition of ABA, and we're going to get into the research, but first I just want to frame a little bit more why PDAers often don't do well on average with ABA and why it matters. And then I'm going to go into the research findings. Okay, so what we know about the PDA brain and nervous system is that they have a hypersensitive nervous system that has a trauma response in often ordinary situations, right? Where even typical parenting or asking them to do chores or putting a demand on them can actually have their brain neurocept, which means before they're consciously aware, the survival part of their brain tells their body, hey, you're either in danger or you're in mortal danger. And what that does for any human is it sets off the nervous system physiologically to stay alive. Right? So it's not just I feel nervous, it's that there is an increase in, your metabolism functioning. You may have to pee or poop to void fluids because you're the antelope on the savannah running from the lion. So your stomach might hurt. You have tunnel vision because you're focused on solving the problem, running away from the lion. Your heart rate increases, you sweat. There's adrenaline, there's cortisol. So this is a physiological fight-flight response to the perception of threat. And there can also be shutdown or fawning or freeze, okay? But what's unique about PDAers? The root cause of why the nervous system is doing this is related to the following. Anytime the survival brain neurocepts or perceives on a subconscious level that you're correcting their behavior, have an agenda, telling them no, trying to teach in the moment, and putting yourself in a position of authority or decision-making above them, and where they don't have autonomy and choice, that's going to be what sets off that nervous system response. So this is what makes our PDA children unique. So if we can extrapolate that logic to the logic of ABA, it's a fundamental mismatch because ABA, as it's defined, is to modify the behavior where you have a parent, a teacher, a clinical specialist, a BCBA who is correcting behavior. And every time that happens, even if the nervous system doesn't show on the outside, like if it's a freeze response or if it's a appeasement or fawning or shutdown response, we're still inside the body experiencing that nervous system activation. Okay, so that's the logic of why ABA doesn't often work or inform good practice with PDAers. Okay, and there's lots of anecdotal evidence that I have from all the now over 1,000 families I've worked with where a lot of children have ended up in burnout because they're complying in the ABA session, but outside of it, their behavior is increasingly explosive, lots of fight, flight, and they're increasingly not able to access their basic needs like sleeping, toileting, hygiene, safety, and eating. Okay? Again, not every single PDA has this experience, and not every single type of ABA has this degree of compliance. However, I'm talking about averages and research and patterns. Okay, because again, I'm coming at it from a researcher's perspective. Okay, why does this matter for us as a community of parents of PDA children? It matters because ABA is often the only option for us. If you're from a marginalized community, if you're from a low-income family and don't have private health insurance, this is the only thing that is going to be covered in the United States. Okay? It is pervasive in the sense that even if we try to communicate with the public schools, they have all been trained in methodologies for behavioral modification and applied behavioral analysis. So the entire special education system is premised on this, quote, gold standard here in the United States. So even if we're not sending our child to a clinic, we are still presenting our children with this logic of applied behavioral analysis in early intervention, in special education, and it has seeped into even public education without special needs children. Okay? I'm not here to take down ABA because I don't operate in black and white, and I know that there's always a distribution of cases. However, what I find myself being passionate about as a parent of a PDAer is that we are not given any other choices. Okay? We are presented with ABA as the only option, and we're shamed and condescended to when it doesn't work, which places the blame on parents not being consistent enough and or something being wrong with our child. And so all of this and the research that I'm going to present really begs the question why this is, because the research from my findings does not back up this attitude towards parents and the lack of viable other options here in the United States and I believe Canada. Okay, so let's get into it. I'm going to be drawing primarily on a meta-analysis, which means it's an analysis of all the other peer-reviewed research articles on the topic of the impact of ABA on children. Okay, so the original sources are drawing on a large sample of like almost 1,500 publications over the last 23 years. And then the researchers in this study used inclusion criteria to winnow it down to 770 studies on the impact of ABA. So like how effective is ABA, applied behavioral analysis, type program. So this is not just the 40 hours a week in clinic. This also includes more educational settings, okay? And of these 770 studies that were peer-reviewed, in theory, objectively by researchers in this field, right? This is not my data. This is a publication from 2022 that I'm drawing on that was peer-reviewed. This scoping analysis was looking at descriptive statistics and patterns from the research itself, okay? And I'm going to walk through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 somewhat stunning findings that do not merit us not having other options here in the United States or in Canada for our unique PDA children who are diagnosed as autistic. Okay, so first, of the 770 studies, none of them measured quality of life of children, parents, or families. Okay? Not a single one. Out of every single study over the last 23 years, 770 research articles that were peer-reviewed, 0 looked at quality of life. Okay, I know that as a parent, that's one of the things that I care about the most. I care if my child smiles and laughs. I care about, do I feel nauseous walking into my own home because of the level of conflict and trauma that is happening outside of any therapies? I care about joy, right? I care about my own mental health because it directly influences my PDA child. And I know that this is true for many of you as well. And a key point here is that it also doesn't measure the quality of life for the children, for the autistic children. Okay? That's just a data point that I'm sharing with you. Okay? The second really stunning finding to me was that the median sample size, meaning the number of children that were studied in a research study, and there were only 3 children as the median number of participants, and the mean, or the average, was 8.12. Okay, so I'm a trained social scientist and I understand statistics, and I was very surprised to see that the sample sizes were so low. That doesn't mean that there's not a large end sample of data. What it does mean is that there might have only been 3 children and they're taking lots of data points on that same child over time. So you can do statistical analysis, but it's only 3 kids. And then the mean is 8. Okay, so just to give you a reference point, I'm a political scientist. I'm trained in methods that are both qualitative and quantitative. I did a original research study in South America, and my sample size was 200 villages, and that was considered small for my discipline. Okay, as political scientists studying voting behavior and policy impact, sample sizes were in the hundreds up to the thousands. So for me to look at what is considered the gold standard for all children in the United States and what's covered by insurance being based on such small sample sizes is really surprising, okay, and doesn't exactly align with evidence-based and gold standard terminology that is often wielded against parents of PDA children. All right, next, what were the key findings from this 2022 study on all the 770 research studies over the last 23 years? A key finding was that only 4% of the studies, so that means 31 studies out of 770 studies, did the following. Actually measured the impact of ABA, applied behavioral analysis, on the target dependent outcome, which is the child's cognitive, language, social communication, emotional, adaptive behavior, autism symptoms, and problem behavior. 2 had a comparison group, meaning comparing to a similar group of children who did not do ABA. So this is a way we determine the counterfactual, like what would have happened if we didn't do ABA? Would they have still grown emotionally, or would another method have potentially helped them to grow in social communication? Okay, and then 3, only 4% did not rely. Sorry, I'm not stating that correctly. Only 4% did actually do the following: measured the impact of ABA, had a comparison group, and did not rely on mastery of a skill as a proxy for the outcomes that I just described. Cognitive, language, social communication, emotional, adaptive behavior, autism symptoms, and problem behavior. And I'm going to go into each of these aspects so that we can understand what this actually means, okay? So let's look at the first. Impact of ABA. So a lot of times studies are framed as like how does ABA, applied behavioral analysis, as a underpinning to the therapy or the educational practice, impact the cognitive development, the language skills, the social communication, the emotional development, etc. of a child? Okay? But many of the actual studies, when looked at by the researchers, were not actually measuring that causal relationship. They were measuring different types of ABA against each other. So what does that mean? We're not actually asking the question, does ABA impact and how does it impact compared to the counterfactual? It's simply taking as a premise ABA is the gold standard. Now let's figure out which type is better, okay? The second part, the comparison group, is the point of we're not actually studying the causal relationship comparatively and in a experimental design, which is if we gave ABA versus a control group of not giving ABA, or another treatment group of what if we did DIR floor time, or what if we did only occupational therapy, and then comparing the same outcomes. And we would have randomly distributed groups of children, and we could compare the averages, because on average those groups would have the same characteristics. So again, the vast majority of these studies on which the conclusions of gold standard here in the United States are based did not do that, okay? They're not actually comparing, but they're drawing causal conclusions that all of our policy here in the United States is based on, and all of us are impacted by that policy because it determines if we have money to spend on things that will actually help our children, and if it's even available, and if our practitioners are trained in ways that will help a PDA, which includes trauma-informed, sensory-based, neurodiversity-affirming practices. Third, the majority of the studies relied on mastery of a skill as a proxy for the outcomes that parents care about. Is language improving? Are they going to be able to make friends? Social communication. Is their emotional regulation improving in their awareness of emotions? Okay, why does this matter? Because what they're actually measuring is compliance. Okay, what's actually being measured in the majority of these studies is not what they're proxying for, it's did the child do this on command? Okay, and I'm going to give you an example from another study, which I'll reference, and I'm reading the appendix of how it was studied. Okay? Yeah, so Persona said, ABA has saved my children and family. Absolutely. So I want ABA to be an option for parents. I don't want it to be a monopoly that is the only option for parents, and I think that's very much in line with your viewpoint as well. This is not a diatribe against ABA. It is what the research says and the lack of options for parents who have PDA children. Okay? Again, no judgment. I'm talking about patterns. I'm talking about policy. I'm talking about large N samples. Okay, so lesson, actions, domain, language. The therapist presents a picture of an action or points to an action occurring in the natural environment and presents the vocal stimulus. What is he or she or they doing? Learning objective, waving. So if the child waves, then it's compliance. They did the skill, and if they do that over and over, we can mark it as consistent. Now let's look at social, greetings and salutations. Responding to greetings and salutations. The child is greeted. The child makes eye contact with the greeter. Non-vocal or vocal response. Then it is marked, yes, there's eye contact, or no, and that is compliance, okay? Prepositions. Language, receptive. The therapist presents a reference object, hands the child another object, and presents the vocal stimulus. Put here. The child places the object behind the reference object. If they do it, it gets marked as yes. If they don't, then no. Okay? So my point here is that for our unique children who are PDAers, whose root cause of nervous system activation is when someone tries to make them comply, and then they have a nervous system response and it codes in their body. This type of proxy for like, are our kids gonna do well, is not applicable. Okay? All right. So again, only 4% of the studies, all right, did not do that. All right, so let's look at the next point of generalization. So I'm quoting from the article here. No study records showing improvements in autism symptoms assessed any measure of generalization. So even if the study did show a positive impact on the dependent outcome of autism symptoms as measured in the way that I described for most, not all, of the studies, there still isn't a measure of generalization. What does that mean? Does it generalize to outside of the clinical, therapeutic, or educational setting? What this is called in the social sciences is external validity of a technique. Okay? So is this approach externally valid, meaning in the home, with the parents, with other kids on the playground, right? And we don't have research on it, okay? And that's a gap in the literature. And I'm just noting that because that's something that I think a lot of parents of PDA children find, that even if their PDA child is complying in the ABA setting or masking at school, it doesn't generalize to outside of the home. And then they're told by the teacher or the school administrator or the therapist, well, you're not doing it consistently enough, and that's why they're having such a hard time. That's why they're having panic attacks and meltdowns and turning into a feral animal and not sleeping through the night and reducing their eating intake to 1 to 2 limited foods. Okay? That's why that's important. Next, samples and populations, okay? As I've stated multiple times on this live and what will be a podcast, is that it's a distribution, okay? So if we take an entire population of autistic children, we have a distribution even within the autistic population. And then if we take out a sample of the PDA autistic children, there's also a distribution that's usually looked like a bell curve within that. So this is not to say that like maybe your child is not in the middle of the bell curve and an outlier, and ABA is going great for that individual child. That's awesome. Like, no judgment. I want you to make your own decisions and do so by observing objectively how your child is doing. And that's the data that we can trust as well as our intuition. However, the research on which policy, insurance coverage, training of our professionals here in the United States is based on the average, right? It's based on research that has these average outcomes. And so I wanted to find one of the outcomes that looked like it would be most aligned with where our children would fall. Okay, so I looked at the mixed diagnosis category, which means your child might have ASD and ADHD and SPD and ODD and all the things. We often find a potpourri of diagnoses for our PDA children, and often if they're very social, they get an ASD diagnosis later. Okay, so we're in the mixed diagnosis category, and here's the finding that I think will be relevant to many of you who have externalized PDAers. The most studied outcomes for the mixed diagnosis category was problem behavior and language. Okay, so for the mixed diagnosis category, 70% of the children showed improvements with problem behavior. Okay? So that's a strong finding. 70%. Most most of these kids improved in the mixed diagnosis category. I'm not refuting that at all. What I'm wondering about is the other 30%, which might be the PDA kids. And wondering like, well, what about us? What about our kids for whom it didn't show improvements and actually might have shown a regression or no change at all? Because for us, with our diagnosed kids, we don't have any other options given to us, even though 30% of them, in this very compelling statistic in favor of ABA, is not applicable to our children, right? So I'm just questioning this notion that this is the gold standard for every child diagnosed with autism in the United States, and the only thing we should be covering as the gold standard and evidence-based approach to teaching our children and providing therapy. So finally, one of the things that this meta-analysis highlighted, and that I agree strongly with, is that there's no research on the long-term effects of ABA, okay? And so we do have some of those primary data points, often on social media, from autistic advocates or people who have gone through ABA who are autistic and then experienced PTSD, trauma, etc. What we do know as a statistic about especially high functioning, quote, high functioning, which usually relates to like, are they more verbal? Can they mask? Those are the ones that have the highest suicide rate, okay? And so what's the measure on that? Like, do we know that as the child is receiving ABA, it's not building up in their system and moving them towards burnout or moving them towards trauma? I don't think we know the answer to that, and I think there needs to be more research before we shame parents into doing this, okay? So in conclusion, this is not to take down the ABA sector. It is not to judge anyone. If you're a BCBA doing trauma-informed work or you're neurodiversity affirming, like, awesome. There's no judgment. The purpose of this is to share with parents of PDA children the actual research so that they can be empowered to make decisions and not feel like they're not smart enough, like they don't know enough, and allow, quote, experts who I would presume have not spent hours going through the research, they were just trained on it in a secondary way, to make you feel like it's your fault. Because it's not your fault, and you are smart enough. And I don't think it's appropriate to shame parents and not present them with other trauma-informed options, sensory-based options, neurodiversity affirming options, so that our children can thrive and so that we can find more joy in the experience of raising a child with a nervous system disability. Yes, so that is all I have for you. I'm sure there's lots of different feels about this. Yeah, so compliance, I hear you about the compliance, but even if we're not doing the like traditional ABA, there is still a dynamic of I am the decider as the person running the therapy, and I am trying to teach these skills, even if there is a connection and a more like social pragmatic approach for a PDA brain that's still going to be neurocepted as a loss of autonomy and equality. And so we really have to examine the logic of any type of ABA. And, you know, if you have a child with OCD, if you have a child who is benefiting from ABA, if you're finding ABA objectively to be supporting your child and it's not impacting basic needs and what's going on at home, then keep doing it, right? That's the whole purpose of my work here, is to give you empowerment, an option to make decisions, and to feel like you can follow your intuition. Because I don't know any better than you do what's going on in your home or your family or with your child, but I want to empower you to feel like that's true also for other experts as well, because it's really your life, your household, your parenting relationship, your caregiving, and your experience that I believe matters in terms of how we raise our children, our unique PDA autistic children. All right, my friends, I hope that was informative and helpful. Not meant to be judgmental, because I went into this like really wanting to understand what the research said. And so now you have the research. So have a good day, everyone.